Have you ever bought a piece of camera equipment and you knew it was going to be good, but you underestimated just how good it was going to be? I recently got this lens, the Sirui 75mm T2.9 from their Venus lens range. And if you're wondering why this lens looks a little bit different, it's because this isn't just a cinema lens, it's actually anamorphic as well. So in this video, I'm going to be sharing with you some of the features of this lens that I love, how I was wrong to underestimate the ability of this lens, but also share a few quirks that comes with shooting with an anamorphic cinema lens. And because we're going to be shooting in anamorphic, there's a few extra steps that you have to take with your camera and the software you're editing it with to make sure it looks right. So the footage you get from this lens, I hate this word so much, but it looks cinematic. It's such a cliche word, but I don't really know how else to explain it. In a standard 16:9 aspect ratio like you're viewing this video, you get the standard black bars at the top and bottom. And normally a lot of people will just add them black bars in when it comes to the editing. But with this lens, it's already part of the image. And that's due to what this lens is doing to the image as it's being captured. But we'll get to that bit a little bit later on, and let's start with the specs that you get with this lens. This lens has no ability to use autofocus, so it's a little bit tricky for someone like me. I'll be the first to admit that I rely on autofocus way too much. It's not even something I even think about because all the cameras today have great autofocus. So if you don't normally use manual focus lenses, it may be a little bit tricky to begin with, but after a little while, you'll start to get the hang of it, and there's a feature of this lens that makes things a little bit easier for you. You may notice that the focus throw on this lens from the closest to furthest distance is rather large. And that's great when it comes to manual focus because it allows you to tweak that focus without throwing out the focus too much if you get it wrong. Also, this lens has very little focus breathing. At first, I couldn't see any on the back of the camera screen. However, upon closer inspection, there is something there. But in the grand scheme of things, it's barely noticeable. Both the aperture and the focus is controlled by the rings which are on the lens barrel, and both of these have geared teeth, so if you ever want to use something like a follow focus motor, it's all set up to do so. Something else to point out regarding the focus is the minimum focusing distance, which is honestly my biggest annoyance when it comes to using this lens. I'll just go ahead and say it. It is nowhere near as low as what I would actually like it to be. The closest you can get to your subject is around 85 centimeters. That doesn't seem too bad at first until you realize that there's a lot of other lenses out there which have a much lower minimum focusing distance. So unfortunately, with this lens, you aren't going to be able to get them really close, tight shots. Moving on to the aperture, T2.9. Not F. With most cine lenses, you'll see a T-stop engraved into the side of the lens rather than an F-stop. T, short for transmission, refers to the amount of light that actually passes through this lens onto the sensor in the camera. Whereas F-stop is a theoretical value which is based on the diameter of the aperture. But to keep things simple, in practice they work very similarly. The smaller the number is, the more light that lens can let through, and also the shallower the depth of field is going to be. Now T2.9 isn't the lowest aperture that you can get when it comes to cinema lenses. And in some situations where you cannot control the light, T2.9 will just not be wide enough to let the correct amount of light in that you need for your camera. However, at the same time, if this is your first cinema lens, T2.9 is shallow enough that it's gonna keep you on your toes when it comes to the manual focus. Honestly, I think if this lens went any lower than T2.9, I probably wouldn't shoot at it for the most part because none of this footage would be in focus. Yeah, take that from the guy who can't manual focus to save his life. The front element of this lens also looks very different, and that's because, as I've said, this lens is anamorphic. One of the characteristics you get from this lens being anamorphic is the horizontal blue flares. It's exactly the same as what you see in some TV shows and some movies, think Transformers, Michael Bay, but more on them flares later on in the video. On the front of this lens, you also have an 82mm filter thread. So if you want to use a VND, an ND, a CPL, pretty much any of your circular filters from your other lenses, you can put it straight onto this lens. And overall, you are getting a great quality lens. It's well built due to its metal casing, and overall, you can pick one of these up for a fraction of the price, dare I say, than other cinema anamorphic lenses. Now, you may be looking at this footage and thinking, doesn't quite look like a 75mm. And that's because it isn't. But it is. With this lens being an anamorphic lens, it has a desqueeze factor of 1.6, meaning that any of the footage that you capture with this lens, you have to stretch it out or desqueeze it by that factor of 1.6. So you're actually getting a width of a 46mm lens, and here's a 55mm shot to compare to. But you're also getting the compression and the height of a 75mm lens. And because of the desqueezing process, you're taking a 16:9 aspect ratio to a 2.8:1 aspect ratio. And that is why when you use this footage in a 16:9 timeline, like I am for this video, you get the black bars at the top and bottom. And I think this mixture of the compressed but wide look is the thing that makes anamorphic footage look so attractive to me. I can remember using the 150mm version of this lens when I shot a video with Sam Holland. It was the first anamorphic lens I'd ever used, and I can remember looking back at the footage and not really understanding why it looked so good, but just knowing that was the look I've always wanted. It's just a look I've seen so many times in films, I've just wanted to recreate it myself at home. But something we need to talk about is them blue flares. For me, it's a quirk that I like, however, I fully respect that it's a quirk that other people may not. These flares are a signature look of anamorphic footage and is normally seen in footage when there's a really bright light source somewhere. With this line of anamorphic lenses, the flares are blue, and even though you can get some lenses with a more neutral looking flare, blue seems to be the most common. If you're filming on a really nice summer's day, admittedly a rarity in England, especially when it's December, I suspect having a blue flare going through the sun could throw a few people off. But as with any lens, it all comes down to personal preference and there's no real right or wrong. But looking at all the footage I've got from this lens, I wouldn't actually say that the anamorphic flare is anywhere near as strong as I would have expected at first. But without a doubt, like any lens, this has its characteristics. Now, one place that I really like these blue flares is when it comes to the nighttime in the city. For me, it really adds a lot of interest to the footage, and when you look at the oval bokeh that you get, it just adds the finishing touches. The oval bokeh is another characteristic that you get from anamorphic lenses. And for me, it just adds that little bit of, I don't know, like, I wouldn't say interest to the out of focus elements because you don't want it to be of interest, but I don't know, it looks more professional. Is that the right way of describing it? I don't know. So when it comes to editing this footage, if you was to drop this onto a timeline, regardless of what kind of timeline it is, all the footage is gonna look a little squeezed. And that's because we have to desqueeze it for it to be viewed properly. Now, I use Premiere Pro, and what you can do in Premiere Pro is highlight all of the footage, right click it and go to modify, then click on interpret footage, and in there you have a section for pixel aspect ratio. And if you click on the drop down menu, you will see a few options that you can choose. However, there is an option for 1.6. The closest that we have available is 1.5, which you can select, but it doesn't give you the true aspect ratio of this lens. However, the way you can desqueeze this footage in any software is by changing the scale option. What you need to do is change the scale of your footage in the y-axis to 62.5%. And if you're using Premiere Pro, just make sure you untick the uniform scale option. And if you follow all these steps correctly, it will give you a true 2.8:1 aspect ratio. Genuinely, this lens is just amazing. I've waited so long to be able to have one myself. And honestly, after using it for the last month, I think I've caught the bug. I think I'm gonna have to get another. I knew I'd enjoy using it. I think I just underestimated how much I would enjoy using it. But if there was one thing I could change about this lens, it would be to have autofocus in it. There are ways to add like the DJI follow focus motor to this and LiDAR and whatever else, but it would be nice to have it just native to the lens, but you never know. I've got a feeling it's just around the corner. But when it comes to using this lens on a camera, you also have the issue of the footage looking squeezed on the back of the camera. On my Sony cameras, unfortunately, I don't have an option to de-squeeze this footage. However, if you have something like the FX3, I'm pretty sure you can. Now, having the lack of the de-squeeze function in the camera doesn't really change the footage, but it does change the inspiration that you have when you're using this lens. And it's a similar situation if you're using this lens with other camera systems. For instance, you can get this lens with an RF mount for Canon, L mount for Lumix, and also the Z mount for Nikon. And some of those cameras from them brands do allow you to use the de-squeeze option, and some don't. Now in my particular situation, you can use an external monitor such as the Ninja 5. But what if you don't already own a Ninja 5 and you don't want to go out and buy one? Well, I've actually found a little bit of a workaround that I'll be doing a video about in the next few weeks. So if you want to see that, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And if you love the colors that you can get from a Sirui lens, but you're not a massive fan of the flares and you want to save a little bit of money, then watch this video right here because I may just have the right thing for you. Thank you very much for watching.